Hey everybody, Invisiblekatana here, and today I would like to discuss video games we would recommend to non-gamers. So there's a buttload of games in the world, of course, buttload of genres. You got action, puzzles, action shooters, action adventures, horror puzzles, I guess non-horror puzzles, Portal, non-horror, just comedy puzzle. Honestly, it is, especially if you go Portal 2, it's much sillier. But there are tons of games out there, and despite video games being the most profitable medium on earth, and I mean, honestly, at this point with the crap Nintendo's doing, and as of recording this, I still don't know if GTA is gonna come out at $100 or not, but man, thanks to Nintendo, it's seeming a lot more likely. Gaming's gonna be even more profitable. Despite all of that though, people that don't play games still see games. And some, at this point, I'm like, it's just stupid. Maybe 15 years ago, it was ignorant, but at this point, it's just pure stupidity. It's like anime. It's like, at this point, you're just an idiot if you're like, anime is just for kids. It's like, you could have tried. You could have at least tried to know the truth at this point. But for those of us that are out there that deal with people that don't really play games, I wanted to go through games that we would recommend for people that aren't really, gamers, where it's like, hey, you see games as this one thing, but here's what they can actually be. Here's what they are in certain aspects, just like anything else. Same with animation, where it's like, hey, you see it as just kid. It's a kid's thing if it's animation. Like animation is still looked at that, which is once again at this point is just stupid. Like it's been decades, and people are still like, if it's animated, it's just for kids. It's like, how can you be that dumb? But this is about video games. Maybe we'll do an anime or just in general animation that's for people that are like, oh, it's just for kids. But for now, we're going with gaming. So of course, it's easy to just be like, hey, a lot of people are watching The Last of Us. A lot of people have seen The Last of Us. I'm sure there are a lot of people that have seen The Last of Us that are in no way, shape, or form even remotely close to someone that's a gamer, and they have no concept of the fact that that is not just a TV show, and it's actually based on a video game. I'm sure there are tons of people that are like that. And that's just how it goes. Like once it's live action, it's for adults. But of course, The Last of Us is, naturally a great example of that when it comes to, a deeper story. I don't know if I would recommend it just because of the fact that it's also like a bit of a dark horror story, especially if you play the game, there's more to it than, what you would get from the show. Like, I mean, let's face it, they barely even have a lot of the infected in the actual live action series. That was one of the big things for people like me that played the game. I was like, oh, I feel like they're not really in the show at all. So gameplay wise, there's definitely a difference there as far as like the fear. It really just depends on how okay someone is with horror, because it is a lot scarier than it seems, even though it's always touted as like this emotional story. It's like, it does have a horror setting. Like it is a horror, in a sense, like a horror suspense type of game. So that one would kind of just depend, on the person and if they can actually handle horror. Because of course, that's another thing. It's a lot different seeing something scary versus you're the one playing the scary thing. Like obviously, if you're watching this, you probably already know, but totally different experience from watching an action, show or movie versus playing the action game, where it's like, I'm the one doing the action. Like it feels different. So depending on how much the person can handle horror, I might recommend The Last of Us. That might be a little tough, but I'd probably still recommend it just because, yeah, it's a good story. And depending on the person, hey, there's a second game. And obviously we'll see what happens with this second season coming out. But I'm very curious about the internet discourse around that one for people that have not experienced the game yet. But The Last of Us, I would definitely say is one of those games. I would certainly say Metal Gear. And once again, it's so difficult to do this because it's like, how do you recommend these things that are, hours upon hours upon hours for people that don't play games? Maybe, you hit them with the YouTube recommendation, like, hey, here you go. Just a full playthrough of the game. And that's the best you can do, because like I said, same with The Last of Us in terms of horror. When it comes to Metal Gear, it's like, well, not everyone's going to want to sit through that story. Not everyone's going to want to experience the gameplay and then sit through the cutscenes and be like, oh, I get it. Or, oh, I'm insanely confused, because admittedly, as great as Metal Gear is, you got to pay attention. You do have to pay attention. So that's another one where it's like, I'd recommend it, because it's like, I love Metal Gear. I love the franchise. Obviously I wouldn't be like, hey, jump straight to 4, no big deal. Like that would be insane with hour-long cutscenes and stuff. But definitely Metal Gear I would recommend. With Metal Gear Solid 3 coming out, it would be something easier to recommend as a a much more modern game with the graphics and everything like that, because that's another element of a game being older. It's like, well, I can recommend this to you as a non-gamer or someone who like just barely plays, but then it's also like, I mean, even as someone who plays games, there are definitely old games where I'm like, I'd like to play them, but do I really want to go backwards that far to deal with like some of these mechanics? Like if I'm used to it, sure, like I could play old Resident Evil all day because I grew up playing those, but there are tons of old games that I didn't grow up playing where it's like, like you're used to it in one sense, and then another old sense is like, I don't want to deal with that. So that's another element. But all of that stuff aside, definitely story-wise, I would recommend Metal Gear as a game that's like, hey, check this out. It's a crazy story. I think you'll enjoy it. It's super fun. I think the gameplay is fun, even though it's mostly stealth versus action. I still think the gameplay is pretty fun. So I would highly recommend, definitely the Metal Gear. Of course, the Metal Gear franchise, as a whole. But obviously, you got to be like, well, are you going to make it past one? Or, with Delta coming out, it's like, hey, you can just check this one out, and it's technically a prequel, so you're still good, and you can, go into one from there. Or if you're crazy, you can be like, hey, you played Delta, that's great. Check out this game, it's called Twin Snakes. There you go. If you want to do it that way, you can do Twin Snakes. But another game that a franchise I would recommend, and this one is in the same vein as kind of The Last of Us, where it's like, it could be its own show. It basically is a show. It's literally done in episodes, and you probably know what I'm going to say at this point, but it's Alan Wake. I would 100% recommend Alan Wake. It got a remaster, which, was just a remaster. It wasn't like, brand new graphics and everything, but it's literally done in episodes. It's meant to be, it's got the clear references, Stephen King, Twin Peaks, all that stuff. It's all there. It's very clear. And it's certainly for people. I have a friend that I had a production company with, and she's not much of a gamer, and I always thought like, man, one day I got to get her to just play Alan Wake, because she is a huge, oh God, I can't remember his name. He just passed away. That's so unfortunate. But, jeez, David Fincher. There it is. No, David Lynch. There it is. Lynch. Yes. Huge fan of him. Still think I said his name wrong, which is so crazy. But she loves his work, and I'm like, she would love Alan Wake. For sure she would love Alan Wake. She'd probably love all the Remedy games with how crazy they get. But that's definitely one where I'm like, it's done in episodes. It's fun. Well, obviously, I think it's fun. That's another thing where it's like, even amongst gamers, Alan Wake was like, the hidden gem for 13 effing years. So, even amongst gamers, it's kind of hard to recommend that one sometimes. But I recommend it story-wise. Another thing where it's like, hey, maybe, watch somebody play it, just get the cutscenes or something. No, you can't do, that's the thing. You can't do that for Alan Wake. You have to see the whole game. You definitely can't do that. Like Metal Gear, I think you could do cutscenes, and obviously you would have, I count codecs as a part of the cutscenes. You do some like codecs and cutscenes, you could get Metal Gear, but for Alan Wake, you have to be like, you have to like see the actual gameplay to do it, because so much of the story is told within the actual game. Plus, picking up all the pages, even if you don't collect all of them, having someone go through that game and see like, oh, you pick up pages of the lost manuscript, and it's like, oh, well, here's things that happened that you never get to see, and then here are elements that I think they only do it like once or twice. But one of my favorite moments is like a slight spoiler, and I won't even go into detail, but in one of the moments of the game, they explain a scene that's actually going to happen. And normally all the stuff that you read is like, oh, this happened either, it's like tangential to what you're doing. So you're in one location and then you read a script and it's like, oh, this is happening somewhere else right now. Or basically I'm reading this script and this just happened, and then you go like a little bit further and you come up on the aftermath of the scene you just read in the page. But there's like one or two times in the game where you get a page that's literally about to be in the cutscene that you're about to go into. And that's one of my favorite moments in the whole game, where they have that, where like you read it and you're like, this is what's about to happen right now. And I love that. So I think that would be a great element. And of course, with Remedy doing their stuff as far as, working on TV and films and stuff, I'm sure at some point we're gonna get an Alan Wake TV show or movie anyway, which would be great. I think, of course, video games, personally speaking, I think should definitely be transformed more into TV shows than they should movies, because obviously, Last of Us is a great example. A 12-hour game, 2-hour movie, it does not compute. Some of them you could probably pull off, They haven't done it right, but Doom, I think, could have been a 2-hour movie. Like, they could have totally done that right and just done some cool action sequences. You go from point A to point B, he kills a bunch of demons. You can do that in 2 hours. Heck, if you want to do 2.5, I'll take it, but it better be good. Mortal Kombat did it. Regardless of what you may or may not think of, Annihilation. I actually liked Annihilation, but Mortal Kombat did it. I was thinking of the old movies, but well, the new movie didn't do the tournament, so I'm like, you could do the story because it's just a tournament for the most part. Street Fighter could do the same thing. Like, you're just doing a tournament, do a couple fights. They can be like 5 minutes a piece. Like, you really don't need an actual fight sequence to be that long for it to be great. And then boom, you're good to go. So like, obviously there are some games that could do it. Obviously with Street Fighter, they've done it before and had nothing to do with the tournament. They just did a thing. But with adaptations being a little bit better, you can do it, you can pull it off. But that's where, kind of the gaming element comes into play. So Alan Wake, I think, is a perfect example as far as, hey, you can check this out. It's literally done in episodes. Easy. Just go through it a chapter at a time. If you want to watch somebody play it, you can do it that way. That way you don't even have to experience it. Just watch someone go through it so you can get the full story. I think Alan Wake is like a great example of that. I would say Resident Evil, but you have to pick the right one because I obviously couldn't recommend, at this point, I couldn't recommend the old games because for someone who's a non-gamer, first off, the element of, going back, tank controls and stuff like that, but also just the storytelling of like the original 3 games is a little different. Like if we were going like Code Veronica, I think is the one that, like, if we're going old tank controls and stuff, obviously I wouldn't recommend Survivor, but if we're going old tank control styles and classic Resident Evil, Code Veronica would be the one that I recommend amongst all the original games because it's like, hey, this is the one that has like multiple cutscenes. You get a better feel for the story. It jumps between characters and it's still easy to follow and you just get a natural story. Once again, depending on the person, maybe just do a YouTube cutscene of it, but it's like, hey, here's a game that I think you can enjoy. Minus some of the, Veronica mechanics that cause some issues even amongst, fans of Code Veronica. But aside from that, there's a lot there that's like, hey, this is actually like really well done and you can experience a full story versus the original 3 games where it's like, yeah, you get a couple of cutscenes and you can certainly experience it, but I think it'll be a little bit more difficult for people going back to like 1, 2, and 3. But between, like I said, all the originals, I think Code Veronica would be number 1, and then, well, actually, you could do 2 and 3. 2 is very long, of course, especially if you're doing like the A and B scenario. It's definitely like a long game to go through for 2 full characters. So depends on the person you're trying to recommend it to. And 3 is like the shortest one. And you could definitely do that. And that also has a decent amount of cutscenes. I just feel like Code Veronica is kind of the balance in between the two where it's a decent length, but also has a lot of cutscenes where, obviously there's revelations and all sorts of stuff going on. Granted, there's like twists and turns in pretty much every Resident Evil game where somebody's doing something crazy and it's like, oh my goodness, I cannot believe that happened. So that's just about every Resident Evil game, but I think Code Veronica does it the best just for cutscene sake and just the way the story is told. I think Code Veronica would be the one that I recommend amongst the originals. And then of course, you could easily go with 0 or the remake, because that does take you back to old school tank controls and also, pre-rendered backgrounds and stuff like that. So those definitely work. And of course they look absolutely amazing. Even to this day, those games look ridiculously great. So you can certainly do that. And it's like, hey, this game looks beautiful for sure. So you could easily do the first game or the second game. And then once again, or not the second game, but 0. But the remake of the first one, I still would say doesn't have a lot of cutscenes, even though they add a lot more compared to the original. I would still say there's not nearly as much explanation and like details of what's going on in the world as a whole. Like Code Veronica just feels big, and I think that's why I would recommend that one. It feels like you're getting more of a movie scale story, if that makes any sense. I don't know if that works for other people, but for me, I feel like that's the best way I can explain it, where not just because they travel, because they literally go to Antarctica, which, how often do you get a story set in Antarctica? So, just for that alone, maybe, Code Veronica. But I think just the scale of that story and like how they have the characters kind of interact with each other, and characters end up, they're looking for each other, they find each other, characters separate from each other, all sorts of stuff happens in Code Veronica, especially if you're doing like the Code Veronica X version. There's, a bit more stuff going on. But I think that would be the one I'd recommend amongst others. And once again, this is for non-gamers. If we're going like, hey, you're just playing the games, I would just say, hey, just start with like the remake. if that's what you want to do. Like start with the remake, or start with 0 if you want. I'd say start with the remake just because it's meant to be like the quintessential Resident Evil experience. I think it's personally the best Resident Evil is the Resident Evil 1 remake. But I would definitely say Code Veronica. If we're doing the actual remake versions of the games, I would recommend either 2 or 3. Although once again, I think going with 3 would be the better option just because it's shorter and they still have multiple cutscenes. You switch back and forth between Jill and Carlos. You have the different locations and then of course the reuse of the location of the hospital. I think I would definitely go 3. 4 could work. I think 4 has, whether it's the original or the remake, 4 is so gameplay focused. Obviously they add a lot more story with the remake, but definitely 4 is so much more gameplay focused that I'm like, I don't know if I truly recommend that one just based on the story alone. It's great, especially if you're into horror. Of course, I think at this point I think the remake of 4 is like the perfect balance that they've ever had of action and horror, which I feel like I said that and at some point I think I said that in an episode, but I don't know if I'd recommend that as far as like non-gamers, like, hey, this is the story I think you should experience amongst, all of Resident Evil. But of course, I certainly wouldn't choose 6 because 6 is so ridiculous that I'm like, you have to be a Resident Evil fan for me to be like, hey, play Resident Evil 6. And even then, so many people don't like Resident Evil 6. I can be like, hey, play this specific level with Leon, the city outbreak level, hands down one of the best moments in all of Resident Evil. Despite all this madness that game has, that is one of the greatest moments in all of Resident Evil is the outbreak level that Leon gets to play through, where you're going through and they have all the stuff with the bar and everything. Despite the one point where the ambulance comes in and you can get killed by it, I've seen so many people die from that, and I died from that the first time I played too, because I'm fighting off zombies. I didn't even hear the thing coming, and then boom, it just smashed right into me, and I'm like, where did that come from? And then the second time I was playing, I was like, oh, okay, it was in the background, but I'm like, I'm freaking out looking for zombies and making sure everybody else doesn't die, and I totally missed the ambulance. So that's definitely something that happens in 6. I know I'm not the only person to have experienced that, even though I still love that level. They should have done like a little cutscene or something to be like, hey, this truck is coming down the street, because when you're looking at all these other things, you're not gonna notice an ambulance coming down the road, which is crazy. Real life, I guess, just absolute madness. But I'd recommend that. Chris's story, I think, is actually really good in that game. I like Jake and Sherry's, but I think Chris has the best story in RE6. Maybe Ada. Ada was the most fun to play because I thought she actually had some scary moments. But I think Chris, once again going with like, hey, you're not a gamer, just here's a story. I think Chris has the best story because it involves him, being a captain that lost his people and then trying to recover from that, where he doesn't. And we see him like just suffering and drinking and stuff and just being like, I'm a failure and I lost my people. He led people for so long successfully, and then he just loses everyone, especially considering it was to someone he thought he knew. It really affected him, and I'm like, this is actually like a really good story, and it might be the best story in the game, realistically. I like Jake and Sherry's. I think they have a pretty decent one, especially with the history of those characters. But you also, if you know those characters, it fits way better. If you don't know them at all, I think they have a pretty decent to okay story. But if you actually know the characters and you go through the game, you have way more of an attachment to who they are and everything that happened, because they don't do too much to really explain like, hey, this is Sherry Birkin and this is every single thing that happened. They explain it, they make it pretty quick, like, hey, you just got impaled by a giant piece of glass, how are you alive? Oh, my dad did this. So they have the exposition moments where it's like, if you never played them, they do the exposition like, here you go. But it definitely fits better if you actually know the characters, or at the very least, obviously, you know Wesker, to have that attachment to Jake, which, bring back Jake. There's so many characters in Resident Evil where we're just like, please bring them back. Where's Jake? Where is Sheva? Where is Billy? I know I'm probably like 1 out of 5 people that care, but like, where is Billy? Bring back Billy Cohen. I need that guy. But I would definitely recommend at least Chris's story. If it came to, if someone was like, Resident Evil 6, recommend it. All right, Chris's story in particular, I'd say, do that one. Because I think for even non-gamers, I think that's the best story in the game. Because Leon's campaign, I think it just gets really, really crazy with like Helena's sister and all the weird stuff that happens there, and then finding out about everything that's going on. And Ada's story is pretty wild, which you kind of have to go through the rest of the game for it to make better sense, even though I know that's different now. You don't have to do that anymore, but I do think having her story last does make sense, especially because you can choose what story to play. It can spoil things in different ways. It just depends on how you actually go through the story anyway. But I'd say Chris's campaign first is definitely the way to go, and the only story I would recommend for someone who's a non-gamer. I think that's the one that's like the most, I don't want to say generic, but it's the most common. I don't want to say generic because it's actually a good story, but it is like the most common style. Like, okay, it's a leader who failed his people, and then he's suffering, and then the new guy comes in, and especially with the way the story ends, especially, it's one of those stories where it's like, man, that's pretty. I'd say bring back Piers. He was, but great ending for a character. Definitely a surprise, and it does kind of suck because of their bond and the way that they kind of built up through that game. But it's like, I think that's what makes that ending for those characters so good, because it was like, oh, we don't get to see him continue. That is his story. That's Piers Niven's story right there. So I actually really like that story, and of course, the ending to that was definitely crazy. One day I'll have to play it from Piers' side, because I'm like, I'd like to have a crazy bioweapon mutation arm and superpowers, so that would be kind of cool. I only ever played as Chris, but one day I'll go back. But I would definitely recommend that, and of course there's a million other games. I would love to say like, hey, here's this specific Assassin's Creed, but I don't think there's a single Assassin's Creed game I could ever recommend to a non-gamer. As great as those games are, I'm trying to think an element of how long it takes, the story that you actually get, which, let's be honest, when it comes to Assassin's Creed, there's only like 2 or 3 games. Well, I haven't played like the last 3 actually, so like Origins, Odyssey, and Valhalla might have some extra stuff to it. I wouldn't recommend Valhalla. Just as a gamer, I know how bloated those games are, or that one in particular, so I wouldn't recommend that. But of course, Assassin's Creed has a lot of good games to it, but you do have to be like, all right, are you really recommending a game from that franchise that even has enough merit? If we're being honest, like, there's so much stuff with the Abstergo thing and the mystery of the outside world and all that stuff. There are only a couple that I think I'd recommend, and of course 2 would probably be one of them. The introduction of Ezio, I think, is really good. Obviously Black Flag, I think, does have a good story in terms of what was his name? Edward Kenway, if I'm not mistaken. There's a couple of Kenways throughout the franchise, so I'm pretty sure, Connor is obviously 3, and I'm pretty sure 4 was Edward Kenway. So that would be my recommendation, would be 4, 2, and honestly, and this might sound crazy because I think it's underrated in general, the number 1 that I would recommend would definitely be Assassin's Creed Rogue. I think that game is excessively underrated because Rogue came out when Unity came out, and of course Unity was Unity, and it was also the next gen game. So a lot of people kind of were like, oh, okay, that's the next gen one. You can do 4-player, multiplayer, and all this stuff, and obviously all the issues and glitches. But Rogue came out as the last gen version, and at the time I didn't have a PS4 or Xbox One or whatever the F the Xbox was back then. So I was like, okay, 360, I'll get Assassin's Creed Rogue. I love Assassin's Creed, let me check out Rogue. And that's one of my favorite ones. I love the story from that, and it's the story of a man who was an assassin, and something crazy happens, and then he decides to change and become a Templar. And I thought that was a great story. I loved that one. I'm like, this one's, I still to this day feel like that game is super underrated because of everything that happened around it, with it being like, oh, it's the last gen title. It was, at that time, it was the first one that came out with no multiplayer for, for the first time in like 3 or 4 years, probably more than that, but they were doing Assassin's Creed like every year at that point, so it probably was only like 3 or 4 years. But it was the first game that didn't have multiplayer within like 3 or 4 games, and it's like, oh, okay, it's just a story. It's like going back to old school. Like, I think they added multiplayer. I feel like they added it in Brotherhood, but maybe it was Revelations. But it was like, yeah, it's been a couple games, and it's the first one where it's like, nope, it's just the story. That's it. You play the story, you beat the game, and obviously excessive unlockables, but I love that story. I would definitely say if there was ever an Assassin's Creed movie, which there already was, if they were going to recreate one, Rogue would actually be the only one I think they could do, because it was short enough and simple enough to where it's like, you could shrink this down. They don't really, they have the Abstergo stuff in there, but it was at the point where they were like, yeah, you're just playing a no-name character. Obviously it was after 3. So it was like, all right, now we're just making you a random person in first person view, and you're working for Abstergo and going into random people's memory. So it didn't even matter by the time they got to that point. It wasn't even like, hey, this is your ancestor. It was just like, you're a random person and you get to tap in. And that was pretty much it. It was, at that point, it didn't even make a difference. So they could easily do Rogue if they were going to do an actual specific game instead of, you know, doing what they did with the Assassin's Creed story or movie, where it was like, hey, they made up their own story, which we got to give them credit for that. They weren't trying to remake a game, even though nobody really liked that movie. I thought it was all right. Like, you know, like I said, I enjoyed it enough, but I definitely wasn't like, this is amazing. It was all right. It was what it was. It was fine. I didn't think it was horrible, but it was what it was. But I could say Assassin's Creed Rogue. If there was one I could recommend as a full recreation, Rogue would be the one. And that would also be probably the Assassin's Creed game that I'd recommend for non-gamers, because I think the story was, you know, like I said, it was the last gen version, so everything was put into Unity. So it was like, let's make this short, sweet, you beat the game, you're done. And it was pretty simple. So it was like, you go through and you just experience that story. So I think that's definitely another one I'd recommend for a non-gamer. I think the story is, once again, it's common enough, you know, just the story of betrayal and being like, you know, like I was working for the wrong side, but historically speaking, the Templars are the wrong side. So it's, you know, obviously you'd have more attachment if you play other Assassin's Creed games, but even the story itself is like, oh, you know, that's actually pretty good. That's pretty good. But I think that would be the last one I recommend. There are, of course, other games out there, so I would love to hear your recommendations. Excuse me. What game would you guys recommend to non-gamers? Like, hey, this is one that can help you understand, like, games are mature. Games just have great stories, and it doesn't have to be, I think I picked pretty much all adult games, but there are, of course, more, you know, childlike games out there where it's like, it could be T for teen, or I'm sure there's some E for everyone games that are just like, holy crap, you know, like there are good ones out there. I'm just thinking, obviously, story-wise, when I say non-gamer, I'm thinking like a full-grown adult that's just like not into games, not like a younger person who would be able to enjoy, you know, some of the sillier things. But of course, there's others out there. I mean, I'm sure if you did Psychonauts, I haven't played Psychonauts myself, but I know that that's a, you know, big one. It's, you know, funny and story-driven and stuff like that. That could work. That could definitely work if you got that sense of humor. Definitely, you could recommend that to someone who's somehow not a gamer but has that exact sense of humor. Like, you're missing out if you have that sense of humor and you don't play video games. You're severely missing out. That's crazy. But I would love to know your recommendations. Like, what games out there do you feel like, hey, I know you don't play games, you feel like they're for kids somehow. This is one that helps you understand, like, no, this is some real stuff. I mean, honestly, at this point, you could even say Mortal Kombat. That would obviously depend on the person, if they could even handle that. That goes, you know, same realm as like The Last of Us and Alan Wake, with it being, you know, horror-based and thriller stuff. Even Resident Evil, I didn't mention that there, but same thing. They have to like be okay with horror or violence when it comes to Mortal Kombat. But even fighting games have great stories now. You can recommend fighting games. So I would love to know your recommendations. What games out there would you say, like, hey, I know you don't play games, but here's one for you. Like, this works. This one works. So I'd love to hear those recommendations. Maybe I'll have some games that heck, honestly, your recommendations might already be on my list because I already have a backlog. But maybe I'll find something new that I just hadn't thought of, or maybe haven't thought of in a while, or just never even knew about. So please put your comments down in the comment section below. And of course, thanks for watching.